Good evening. I speak to you in the name of the Lord. Please be seated. I've entitled my talk for this evening, God as the Gardener of Eden and of our world. Now, we heard in Genesis, in the reading, the image of the garden is a place of abundance, beauty, and productivity. A very positive image. We heard of God as the creator of that garden, as the gardener in Genesis. God had prepared the plot. He had planted. He fed. He provided for. These are all roles that a gardener must do. Now, when I think about a gardener, I'm really influenced by my dad, because my dad was a very passionate gardener. When we moved into our first single home on St. Patrick Street, we were on a small 35 by 100 foot lot. But my dad had over half of that in gardens, both to provide food for us, but also to provide flowers for beauty, and plants and shrubs as homes for insects and birds. Now, my dad was what I would call a year-round gardener. It started in the winter, actually. And in the winter, he would look at the seed catalogs to see what was going to be new for next year. He would think about what had done well last year. He would think about how things fitted together. As soon as we had a spring melt, my dad was in the garden planting peas. My dad believed that you should be able to get 3 crops a year out of a garden in St. Catharines. And the peas were, for us, a sign that spring couldn't be that far away. Now, pretty much inevitably, those peas were covered again in snow. But the plants were designed to deal with that. And sure enough, usually starting sometime around mid-April, we would have our first feed of peas from the garden. Now, when the rest of the garden was ready to be worked, it was the beds needed to be cleaned up and the soil needed to be prepared. This would involve adding mulch, because we lived on a clay soil that was very heavy and very tight. So each spring, peat moss, other organic matter, or sawdust would be collected, spread on the ground, and then dug in order to enrich the soil and help the soil and the plants that would be in it. Now we've got everything planted. It had to be fed and watered. It had to be nourished. There also had to be some weeding and pruning done. In the fall, we come to harvest, cleanup. The piling of the vegetative growth into our compost. Not a bin at that point. It was simply a wire fence that we stuffed things into. And if it was getting too full, my sister and I were given the job of jumping up on top and crushing it down so that more could go in. Now, then we come back and we're back to winter. So we have this cycle. Now, when I was asked to talk about an image of God, I had to really think about which image I was going to choose. The amazing thing to me was that of all the images, the one that came to my brain the first and the clearest was that of a gardener. I think the image of God as the gardener of Eden has always been a strong image for me, and has helped me to relate and understand both the world and God. God as a gardener is tied very directly to the world and to the land. A gardener needs to get his hands dirty. He can't just be sitting there on the sidelines. A gardener is involved in the world. It is an image that provides me with hope. A hope that as I continue my faith journey, I indeed can grow and change. I want to be a good plant in the garden. Now, there are at least 77 references in the Bible to God as a gardener. Now, I didn't look up all of them, and I'm not going to talk about each one, just so you can relax. We will be finished in a reasonable time. But, you know, in Isaiah, in telling the story about Israel, the Israeli people at that point are compared to the withered grass and condemned to live in a desert. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that God has another plan. And he's going to make that desert, and it's described as like Eden. The wasteland will become a garden. Again, God is there as a gardener. There's also another reference about where in the New Testament describes himself as a vine and God as the gardener of that vine. And next week Robert's going to talk about that. So I'm not going to touch that one anymore. But even in the book of Revelations, there is a description of the land of plenty with the life-giving river separating the garden. Again, that reference that God is providing and the garden is going to be there. So if God is the gardener, the world is his garden. People are plants in the garden. We heard that God planted the humans in his garden. God gave them all they needed. Turned out it wasn't what they wanted, but he gave them all that they needed. They were indeed in a paradise. We all know what happens in that story. Now, some plants are productive and serve aesthetic purposes or maybe even medicinal purposes. Some plants we consider to be weeds or infestations. Weeds can and do impact the productiveness of a garden. God as a gardener must deal with this issue. But God also knows that plants aren't perfect in terms of shape, size, and production. God knows that with nourishment and care, a plant can be improved. Now in our reading tonight, we can see God as a creator and a gardener. The first reference to God in the Old Testament is to God as a gardener in that Genesis image. God is not a warrior, a judge, or a king. He's introduced as a gardener. The one who nurtures all life is the protector of the world, a planter, a designer, a pruner. God creates the Garden of Eden, provides all that is needed for the inhabitants. He tends his garden. I think it's significant that it's called the Garden of Eden, not just Eden. It provides an image, the fact that it's being tended. He ensures that it's good and healthy. The garden thrives under God's care. The plants in the garden thrive under God's care. This is an incredibly strong image to me of a caring God. A gardener to be successful must provide water, food for his plants. He must create conditions to allow the plants to grow and flourish. God's caring words can be successful in doing that. Sometimes results are faster than others. For example, when trying to modify a tight clay soil, it takes many years for a gardener, adding peat moss or organic material or whatever, to change the nature of the soil and make it more productive. God knows this about us, and knows that his people take time to respond. In tending to the garden, there is a need to weed and to prune. Pruning done carefully and at the right time leads to new growth and regeneration. It removes the dead wood from the plants. But sometimes after pruning, the tree or the shrub can look barren temporarily. I believe sometimes after we are pruned by God, we may also feel lonely, discouraged, or in pain. It's a step that's necessary for new growth to occur. Sometimes, as human gardeners, we weed the garden to remove plants that are going to have an impact on the productivity of the plants that we consider to be important. I'm not quite sure how that fits with what God does, but it's got to fit there somewhere. Way back when, in the last century, in 1965, there was a group called the Birds, and they sang a song called Turn, Turn, Turn. I was amazed by that song. It was a song that gave me hope. It was a song that was about how things change. And what I was even more amazed at afterwards was that I found out that it's actually based on Ecclesiastes. And it says, to everything there is a season, a time to every purpose, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. This song happened to be composed by a minister's son who sang in that group. Now, working in the garden requires you to have a knowledge of plants and seasons. We know there are perennials that last many years. There are annuals that need to be replaced each year. There are trees and shrubs that can live for hundreds of years. Now, a lot of times when we think about gardens, we focus on the annuals. And because of that, we tend to think of it in terms of 4 short seasons. Now, I think in view of the fact that of the cycles in life, that seasons for God's purposes are not the seasons that we know. God works on a different time frame. Often his purposes may be unknown or unclear to us. Why did something happen? Why are the weeds not removed immediately? But sometimes even weeds serve a purpose. In considering the world as God's garden, there are both productive plants and weeds. In the world, it appears that God allows both to exist, but provides the opportunity for us to be productive plants and to overcome the weeds. God will make decisions in his time as to what should be pruned and uprooted. Now, there are a couple of different approaches to actually doing gardening. You know, sometimes you can see them if you were to go down along the Niagara Parkway at Queenston, the horticultural school. You'll see a very formal garden, laid out in an orderly fashion, very neat, whatever. You can also now see at the back of the school a garden which is a naturalized garden. It's more chaotic. It's not all straight lines. I think it's this latter view of a garden that God believes in. Things aren't just straightforward, they're complex. I think that there is obvious chaos and dysfunctionality in our world. But that doesn't say that our world isn't being tended to, and we as plants aren't being tended to. In thinking about the reading for tonight and when it was written, the image of God as a gardener would be very compelling to the listener. The people at that point were directly tied to the land. Their future depended upon what food they could grow. In our urbanized world today, where many people now live with limited contact with food production, the image of God as a gardener may not be nearly as compelling. but I think it's still important. When I think of God as a gardener, there have been many challenges that God has had to face, starting from Adam and Eve in the garden and their actions. As the gardener, God continues despite what happened. So God is always there for us, caring and tending his garden. If we are with God, we will bear fruit. We will make the world a better place for others. In summing up, the image of God as a gardener allows us to see God as the provider of all we need. It allows us to see God as a patient God. It is in his time, not our time, that he makes decisions. It allows us to acknowledge that God is a weeder and a pruner. It's not our role to be judge. God is always there watching and accessible to us, nourishing us and hoping that we will respond to his feeding. The image of the gardener is therefore helpful for us every day as we deal with the reality of our lives in this world. As we know, the world is often not very pretty nor fair, but it does not mean that God is not tending his garden. Of course, the image of God as a gardener is incomplete, because it cannot address all the dimensions of God. It does, however, provide us a way of understanding our relationship with God that may help us come closer to him. Now, before I close, I want to speak about another garden, a garden that's close at hand. It's the garden that you walked through tonight as you came up to the parish home. This is a garden that my sister Anne, my wife Sue, and I had created in memory of our parents. It is designed as a meditation garden. It is a place of peace and tranquility. It's a place where you can get close to God. It is a garden. Thanks be to God.